All right. All right. Settle down, folks. Grab whatever you're sipping on. Kick back, because we've got a real brain tickler for you today.
That's right. We're diving deep, pun intended, I guess, into something a lot of you have actually been asking about.
Yeah, this whole idea, this question of whether smaller countries really have any diplomatic muscle in the world today.
That's a common perception, definitely.
Before we really dive in, though, just a quick shout out to our friend Mickey over at Mickey to Life on YouTube. Seriously, folks, if you're looking for some fun, some engaging stuff, go check out his channel.
Yeah, good stuff over there.
Tell him we sent you. Okay, so this whole small country, no diplomacy thing, it feels familiar, right? You see a smaller nation facing a big power, and you just kind of assume they're going to get rolled.
Uh-huh. And lots of you wanted us to dig into that. Is it always true?
That's the plan. We've pulled together some, pretty fascinating bits and pieces.
We have. We've got reports on Taiwan's ongoing tariff talks with the United States, some stuff about the pressures Taiwan's facing internally, and even some historical perspectives.
Right, perspectives on whether a nation's size really dictates its diplomatic power. It's a big question.
So we're looking at the nitty-gritty of these U.S.-Taiwan negotiations, the domestic politics in Taiwan, and, yeah, even dusting off some history.
Our mission today, basically, is to really unpack this small country, no diplomacy idea, especially looking at Taiwan. We want to give you a clearer picture of the challenges, sure, but also the possibilities.
See what holds up and what doesn't.
Okay, let's get into it then. So the first thing that jumped out was that Taiwan and the U.S. are like right in the middle of these tariff negotiations. And according to reports, Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, has even said things are progressing smoothly. That sounds pretty optimistic, doesn't it?
It does on the surface, but it's important to get the context, U.S. President Trump announced this global reciprocal tariff policy.
All right.
And the U.S. trade rep mentioned Taiwan specifically as one of the first countries they'd negotiate with. President Lai has actually said he wants to aim for something like the USMCA deal.
The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
Yeah, hoping to start discussions maybe from a base of zero tariffs.
Wow, zero tariffs. That'd be huge. But hang on, these reports also mentioned the U.S. had previously put a pretty hefty 32% tariff on Taiwanese goods.
They did.
That's now been temporarily cut to 10% while they talk. Why such a high tariff initially? And what kind of impact did that have?
Well, that initial 32%, as one source lays out, was a significant challenge, particularly for Taiwan's agricultural and fisheries sectors. I mean, they rely heavily on exports, right? So a tariff that high could seriously hurt their international competitiveness.
Makes sense.
The fact that it's down to 10% for the talks, well, it suggests maybe a willingness from the U.S. side to engage, to actually negotiate.
And it seems like Taiwan is actively trying to, make its case. President Lai emphasized Taiwan's strengths, especially in machinery.
Right, suggesting they could play a key role in U.S. reindustrialization efforts.
And he also acknowledged U.S. concerns about washing of origin and stressed that Taiwan needs to address those issues.
And that's crucial. Addressing things like washing of origin, basically, relabeling goods to avoid tariffs is vital for building trust in any trade relationship.
Yeah, you got to have trust.
So Taiwan taking proactive steps there, that can definitely strengthen their negotiating position.
So, okay, on the surface, it sounds like Taiwan's at the table. They're being taken seriously, aiming for a good outcome. But then another source we looked at paints a, let's say, slightly more complex picture.
Oh, here we go.
Especially when it comes to Taiwan's position as, a smaller international player. This is where it gets really interesting.
Right, the small country limited diplomacy angle. This source highlights that because Taiwan isn't recognized as a sovereign state by most countries, it means they operate with, let's say, limited traditional diplomatic leverage in these kinds of international negotiations.
So how does that actually play out? Like in practical terms, when you're talking tariffs with a superpower like the U.S.?
Well, it means they can't necessarily rely on, traditional political clout or military muscle to win concessions.
Right.
Their negotiating power is tied much more to their economic importance, think semiconductors.
Huge importance there.
Exactly. And their willingness to cooperate on issues the U.S. cares about. The source also points out, pretty starkly, that Taiwan's economy is super export dependent.
Right, which makes them vulnerable.
Very vulnerable to U.S. tariff policies. If your biggest customer gets tough, you have less room to push back.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
But it's not just the external pressures, is it? These sources also talk about pretty significant domestic challenges for the ruling party in Taiwan, the DPP.
Oh, absolutely. Internal politics are a big factor here. The opposition parties, the KMT and the TPP, they're demanding reciprocal deals, and they've been quite critical of the DPP's negotiation strategy.
What are their main concerns?
They're particularly focused on how tariffs might hit farmers and fishermen. They want the government to take a tougher stance to protect those industries.
And it sounds like the opposition is even suggesting some potentially tricky ideas.
You could say that. The KMT suggested these offshore free trade zones in Kinmen and Liancheng counties,
Oy.
basically allowing Chinese goods to be relabeled as made in Taiwan to get around U.S. tariffs on China.
Whoa, wait. That sounds problematic.
It is. Very controversial. The DPP slammed the plan, arguing it could look like collusion with China, potentially wrecking trade relations with the U.S., and even posing a national security risk.
Yikes.
So this internal political division, it definitely adds another layer of complexity. Makes it much harder for the DPP to present that united front in the negotiations.
Right. Hard to negotiate when you've got infighting. And even if the DPP does manage to strike a deal with the U.S., it's not over then, is it? There's still the legislative yuan hurdle.
That's exactly right. The negotiated agreement has to be reviewed and approved by their legislature, the legislative yuan.
And the opposition has a strong presence there.
They do. They hold significant sway and could potentially block the whole thing. So that further limits the DPP's room to maneuver. It really highlights the internal pressures they're under while trying to get a good trade outcome.
So even if President Lai sounds optimistic, there are clearly some pretty big domestic and international headwinds.
Definitely. Significant headwinds.
Okay, so this brings us circling back to our main question. Does being a small country automatically mean you have zero diplomatic leverage? Some of our sources offered really interesting counterpoints.
Yeah, that piece, weak nations don't necessarily lack diplomacy, was fascinating.
It uses the example of Gu Weijun, right?
Yeah.
A prominent Chinese diplomat back in the early 20th century arguing against this exact idea. What was his story?
Well, what's fascinating is the argument that even historically, when China was, arguably a much weaker nation on the world stage,
Sure.
skilled diplomats like Gu Weijun were able to pull off significant diplomatic successes. How? By leveraging international rules, by building really strong personal reputations, and by deeply understanding the global landscape.
So knowing the system and how to work it.
Exactly. The piece contrasts Gu's approach, which was grounded in international law and modern diplomacy, with maybe more traditional, sometimes less principled methods of earlier diplomats.
So the key takeaway from Gu seems to be that diplomatic skill, knowing international norms, building alliances, getting support, that can be really powerful, regardless of your country's size. It wasn't just military might.
Precisely. Skill and strategy can be equalizers. And our sources touch on more contemporary examples, too.
Like what?
Well, one editorial discussed the Newfoundland model. The argument there is that for small countries to protect themselves, it's not just about appeasing bigger neighbors.
Right, not just rolling over.
It's about building strong internal strengths, both soft power, like, a high quality of life, a thriving economy, and hard power, like a capable defense force, building resilience from within.
Okay, so applying this thinking to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Even with the challenges of being smaller, not fully recognized, their huge economic power, especially in semiconductors.
Can't overstate that.
And their democratic values, those could be seen as real sources of leverage, couldn't they?
Absolutely. Taiwan's critical role in global supply chains gives it definite economic clout. And its commitment to democracy aligns it with many Western nations, potentially opening doors for support, even without formal recognition.
It's like having allies based on values, not just treaties.
Sort of, yeah. It provides a different kind of connection.
So the narrative of small country, no diplomacy, really does seem way too simplistic. It feels more about strategically using the assets you do have, navigating complex relationships, and, skillful negotiation.
It's about playing the hand you're dealt very skillfully.
So what then, according to our sources, might the future hold for Taiwan in this context, given all this?
Well, the sources suggest the outcome of these specific tariff negotiations will have pretty significant economic and political consequences for Taiwan.
Makes sense.
A successful agreement could really help stabilize their economy and strengthen that strategic relationship with the U.S. But failure, that could worsen economic pressures and potentially affect relations with China, too.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. And long term, the need for Taiwan to diversify its trade partners is also really highlighted. Reducing reliance on any single nation is key.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket, basically.
Pretty much, yeah, especially in this geopolitical climate.
It sounds like Taiwan's future really depends on this mix of smart domestic policy, really skillful diplomacy, and a very clear-eyed understanding of its strengths and vulnerabilities on the world stage.
That sums it up well.
The idea that size is the only thing that determines diplomatic success. It just doesn't seem to hold up when you dig into it. So what does this all mean?
Well, I think it means, as we've seen, that the concept of small country, no diplomacy is far from a simple truth. It's much more nuanced.
Yeah, Taiwan's current situation, juggling these U.S. tariff talks while dealing with the political pressures at home, it really highlights just how complex it all is.
And looking at history, like with Gu Weijin or modern ideas like the Newfoundland model, it just shows that diplomatic success isn't solely determined by how big you are on a map.
Right.
Things like economic importance, strategic alliances, how unified you are internally, and just sheer diplomatic skill, those play crucial roles.
It really makes you think about the different kinds of power a country can wield, doesn't it? It's not just military might.
Not at all.
It's also about economic influence, maybe moral standing, the ability to build meaningful relationships globally.
Absolutely. Different tools in the toolbox.
So for you, the listener, as you process all this, maybe consider this.
Yeah.
What other examples can you think of where a smaller nation has successfully navigated some really complex international waters?
Yeah. What do you think are the key ingredients for their success?
Definitely something worth mulling over. It challenges assumptions.
It does.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. We hope this has given you a more nuanced view of the challenges, but also the opportunities facing smaller nations in international diplomacy. Until next time.
Yeah, hope it gave you some food for thought. Until next time.